There we go. All right, so I'd ask those of you who are interested to submit some images. Up till this point, we've only gone through my own photos, so I thought it would be helpful if we started to see some images from others as they came in. And some of you obliged with that, and I appreciate that. So I've got a handful of photos here in Lightroom, and we'll just go ahead and dive into those and look at what you guys have submitted. So here we go. Let me get this out of the way. All right. So these are some photos that that you guys submitted, and I think we'll just sort of go through in order. This is actually one of my own. This photo here. Let me turn on the pointer. I think that was here. Spotlight. Yep. Get this whole thing out of the way. There we go. So this is one that actually is one of mine. If we have time, we'll come back to this photo because it kind of covers everything we've talked about in the class, what we might be able to do with that one. But let's dive into this one. This one was submitted by William Helms. I don't know if William's on. In fact, I think he said he couldn't be here. He was going to watch the course in replay. So this is a wildflower. Wow, look at those wildflowers. I haven't even actually looked at most of these yet to see what had been submitted. And so I don't really have a clear idea. Just think of this as a fresh look at what we're going to dive into. And as I look at these photos, so I'm always looking at what makes this photo good. What are the elements that I know we're going to want to either emphasize or make sure we maintain? And here, these wildflowers, obviously this is the dominant area. When I look at this, the part that catches my eye is this right here, kind of just left of center. You have this nice patch of wildflowers here in the lower, kind of that lower thirds section, and that looks like lupins, nice juxtaposition between the lupins and whatever this pink thing is. So, you know, it's a nice combo. Overall, I think the image is a little bright. It's an overcast day, which of course made the flowers themselves stand out quite beautifully. But it means there's not a lot going on in the sky, but there is some nice texture up there. You can see there's good detail in the clouds. In terms of things that I don't like so much, this tree here doesn't seem to really play much of a role. It's nicked off here at the top. I'm not sure, we could probably get rid of it with some cloning if we wanted to put some effort into it, but it's not such a big deal that I'm too concerned about this tree. However, this tangle over here, I think might be a little bit too much. So as I think about this, somebody wants to come in. As I think about this photo, I see this tangle as being, maybe not something we need to have. So I could see cropping this in a bit from the right, darkening in the sky and probably bringing in some clarity and maybe a little contrast to really enhance what's going on here in the clouds, because I think there's a real potential here to be interesting. And then we'll see what we can do. Maybe a little bit of extra vibrance, maybe a touch of saturation here in the lower portion of the frame where the wildflowers are. And I think we can come up with something that's really nice. So let's start off with that crop. And it looks like the original of this, he'd already cropped it a bit when he sent me this photo. And so it's showing up as a partial crop. I'm going to adjust his crop a little bit. I don't like that tree, I don't like that it's ticked off just at the top. I would rather see it gone and just concentrate on what's going on down here, or at least show the top of the tree. So I'm going to expand that out a little bit. I do agree with his bottom crop. I think, there's not, I don't know. I mean, that's pretty good. So I'm going to leave it like that for now. I don't think that's too bad, but I am going to bring in this side, although that does bring us into a little bit of a more square format than I normally do. So we'll bring up the bottom a touch. And I think that's a little nicer crop. We've kind of got this tree here, which now actually plays a role in the image because we have this up here in that top third corner. And then we have this bunch of flowers down here. And you have this little bit of a juxtaposition between this barren, maybe dead tree and this bright patch of fresh green flowers, which I think is nice. And those two play off of each other fairly well in this photograph. So the next thing is we'll just go through the quick little adjustments. I don't think I'm going to change anything. The white balance looks okay, so I think we'll maintain that. We're not going to do anything with the tints, so we're not going to mess that around. Actually, one little tool I did want to talk about that I didn't talk about when adjusting white balance before was this eyedropper. And if you have a part of your frame that is white, so if there's an element in your image that is true white, or in reality was true white, so say like the tip of this flower is pretty darn white. So you see where I'm hovering that over? Lightroom pops up this little target thing, and you can actually pick the individual pixel you want to choose. So if there's a white flower, that's pretty darn close to white, you can select that, click, and it will adjust your white balance based on what that white point is. And actually, it looks like this was, pretty darn accurate. So, yeah, the white balance custom, it didn't actually tell me what it set that to. 5350, it was 5250 when shot in camera. So Lightroom and the camera chose a nearly identical white balance. But if you do feel like you want to do some adjustment, that little tool is a nice little trick for setting your white balance. Okay, exposure. It's a little bright, but I don't think it's too bad. The foreground in particular is properly exposed. So I don't think I'd want to do any global change. I could do a little adjustment here just to see what, what the image might look like as things brighten and darken, which might give me some idea for how we're going to deal with it later. But I don't think I'm going to make any change. You can see as I darken the sky a little bit, some more detail comes in. But because I'm darkening the whole image, I'm losing some of that foreground brightness, and I don't want that. So, but that does give me an idea that I can darken the sky a little bit and bring that in. One thing I did just notice is I think the horizon line is a touch off. So I'm going up here, select my crop tool again, grab the angle tool within that, and now I'm going to go across the horizon line, and it is just a touch off, straight into that horizon, much better. And yeah, not bad. Highlights. So the highlights are the brightest portion of our frame, and I'm going to bring those down a little bit because that's mostly going to be the sky. And you can see a slight change starting to happen when I bring that down, some more detail coming into that sky. Got somebody coming in. Welcome, Joe. I'm glad you made it this time. And so the next thing we're going to think about here after we drop the highlights down, which brought in a little bit more detail and less brightness into that sky, is, generally when you reduce the highlights, you're going to play with the shadows a little bit too. Sometimes you darken, sometimes you brighten them. If you reduce the highlights all the way and bring the shadows up all the way, you tend to get kind of an HDR kind of look. In this case, because it's not a super high contrast scene, it actually doesn't look all that terrible to bring in that, but I do like a little bit more darks. I like a little bit more contrast in that foreground area. So I might even reduce my shadows in this a little bit. Let's bring that up where we had it before. And whites, you can see by looking up at the histogram, there's no true pure white in this image. There is a little bit of pure black, probably just added that, but it's so microscopic, I don't even see. When you hover over that, the pixels, remember, will blink blue, and I actually don't even see where they're blinking. So it's obviously not a substantial proportion of the frame. Whites, I'm just going to kind of slide it up and down. Obviously, I don't want to go up because that's blowing out the sky. But I might bring it down. Nope, I don't want to bring it down either because it really does help us provide a little bit of a pop into the foreground. And so I'm going to take it up to, a point where I'm not cutting off the histogram here on the right, but I am definitely, bringing a little bit more of that sort of pop into the image. Blacks, I probably won't mess with too much. I don't want to cut too much of the very darkest parts of the frame out. And it doesn't make a big difference one way or another. Texture. So as I mentioned, this guy increases the kind of apparent sharpness of the image. And so I'm gonna take it all the way down. So here, with a flowery image, lowering the texture, kind of interesting. I mean, it makes it look like a Monet or something. It's a really artistic kind of look, painterly kind of look to it. So, I could see a rendition of an image where you might actually want to reduce the texture. Most of the time I bring it up. You know, in photography, it seems like we're really wrapped up around sharpness. And you can see as I'm going to go all the way down to the left again, and now I'm going to bring it slowly up to the right. And you can really see that detail starting to pop into that. But if you take it up too far, it can look painterly again, but in an entirely different way. So we go from like the Impressionists to some kind of, you know, much more realistic kind of style. Usually somewhere in between is a bit more appropriate. I'm going to bring it up to, you know, somewhere in here probably. Add some apparent sharpness to the flowers without making anything look a little too strange. Clarity, as I said, increases the contrast at edge points. And so a reduced clarity can make it all look very milky. I don't particularly like a reduced clarity look. I don't really see a reason you would want to do that. But if you take it up too high, it really makes the contrast overall too much. So again, a moderate level of clarity, either occasionally as a reduction, usually as an increase, is often appropriate. And you can see a bit more of that detail come into the clouds. I'm going to step back a notch to look at the clouds. You can see that clarity made the clouds pop just a little bit. So that helps us a little bit there. Dehaze, you know, it's that hammer we talked about. It can really overdo things quite quickly. You can see pixelation coming in when it's overdone. You reduce it, it looks like you've got it in a, you know, cloudy day or foggy day. So rarely is the dehaze super useful on an image that's already clear and crisp like this one is. Vibrance, now here's an area we definitely want to give it a little pop. So we're going to increase that vibrance to really, the greens kind of get overdone, but we can talk about that, how to reduce that. But I love what it's doing to those blues and pinks. That's pretty nice. Maybe a touch of saturation. Saturation is very easy to overdo. You definitely don't want it to look like a cartoon like that would. But, you know, 5 to 10 to even 15 points of saturation can be quite appropriate. It did make the greens look a little bit of, I don't know, what color is that? Mint chewing gum? You know, it's a little too much. And so, as we talked about before, we can go down here to this HSL and color section and grab our little button here that allows us to hover over the image. And this sort of limey green is the one I'm most concerned about. It looks like it's got a bit of yellow. It's mostly yellow, in fact, but with a little bit of green in it. And so I'm just going to go up and hover over that and just scroll down with my mouse just a touch and sort of reduce some of the saturation in those greens. And that, you know, that helped us keep it keeping it from looking quite so cartoony. Now, one thing Heather had asked about that I haven't touched on yet in this course at all was the tone curve. So curves work a lot like the sliders up here. So and I honestly don't use curves all that much. I prefer how the sliders allow me to control things. However, it can be a pretty appropriate way to deal with the level of contrast and brightness that you apply to different parts of your image. The general way to do it is you go along the line and apply 3 dots, 1 click, 2 click, 3 click at each of the cross points. So up here and wherever it crosses those 3 center lines, and that gives you a place to adjust from. So this left lower portion of it is our dark portions of our frame. So if I wanted to make the lower part of my frame brighter, I can slide that up and you can see the shadows and the blacks coming out of the image as I slide it up. It starts to make it look kind of hazy. A moderate level of that, you know, maybe that's not so bad. Or I can bring it down, darkening just the darker half of my image. Usually the changes in curves are quite subtle. The bigger the curve you apply, the more dramatic the change. Same thing up here if I wanted to go up and adjust the just the sky or the very brightest parts of the frame, for example, I can pull that down. If I want to make it brighter, I can push it up. You can add as many of these little dots in here as you want. So if for some reason you just wanted to darken, say, this part, so you can use the little dot finder again. If I just wanted to darken this part of my clouds, do you look on the tone curve over there on the right, and you can see as I scroll around on top of that, you can see that just the very brightest part, almost up in that top right corner, is the part that's being affected. So if I wanted to adjust that, I put in a little anchor point, I add another point where that area was the problem, and then I can adjust down. And you can see it kind of works like a teeter-totter. So when you bring one section down, it'll push up the next. So you can see how that you can do fairly small scale changes. If I didn't want to push up this section at all, I can add another point there and just pull down that bright part of the frame. So you can imagine there would be some use. It allows you a lot of fine control, whereas highlights just covers everything in that top third of the image. In this case, you can really do microscopic detail changes in specific brightness points. It's a little tedious, but it's also very powerful. And so if you want to fiddle with that, definitely learn with it. Most of the time, the highlights, shadows, whites, and blacks will do that. If you're familiar with curves in Photoshop, this is identical. It's exactly the same as it is in Photoshop, as it is in Lightroom. It even works the same by applying the dots along the way. I don't particularly like anything that we just did there, so I'm just gonna get rid of it. Straightens that curve out again. But anyway, that's how the curves work. It can be a useful tool if you want to play with it. I find I use it pretty much just on particular images that have an issue, something that I want to change. You can actually also just grab the full corners too and bring the whites way down, making it look very gray, and that more or less changes the whole exposure. But again, I'm going back here when I'm in Lightroom, as we talked about, when I make a change I don't like, all I have to do is just step back down to the section I didn't before I made that particular change. So that's curves. We talked about that. We talked about that. And detail work. So this is our sharpening and noise reduction. I don't think we've got, there's a little bit of noise. You can see here in the sky, there's a little bit of noise throughout, honestly. Nothing we can't deal with. A little bit of noise reduction, however, is in place. It's sharp. I'm not even going to mess with sharpening, but a little noise reduction, probably in the 25 range. And I didn't fix it as much as I expected it to. Oh, there it goes. It just hadn't adjusted yet. So, yeah, that corrected a good portion of our noise reduction. We talk about noise a lot in digital photography, but the fact of the matter is, at the sizes, we're mostly using our images, which is to say our phones, and at biggest, our laptop screens. Noise just doesn't matter. So, if you are mostly sharing images on social media, if you're printing and you're printing large, noise matters a lot. But if you are simply sharing images on social media or enjoying them for your own use, don't worry so much about noise. It's one of these things that we talk about a lot in photography, and it really doesn't matter to most photographers whether they have a bit of noise. It will matter for publications. If you're trying to publish your images, publications don't like it. All right, and one of the last things that I'll do in this first pass is a little bit of vignetting. We talked about that. A vignette's often pretty nice, particularly in a landscape image where we're trying to draw our attention towards the center part of the frame. Maybe that's a little too much. All right. Okay, so that's not bad. We can go down here. We can see where we started and where we finished. And we can see that, our colors are brighter. We've got better contrast happening down here. We've got much more detail in the clouds, but I think we can do better. So let's do a second pass. Now, there's two ways that we can adjust just the sky. We have the brush, and we've got the graduated filter tool. The brush, in this case, the easiest way to do it's the graduated filter. The brush is not going to be able to brush out every little branch in this. So we are going to catch these branches no matter what we do, unless we want to put a god-awful amount of work into it. So I'm going to grab the graduated filter tool, and I have my exposure set over there. One of you, I believe it might have been Eleanor, was asking about how to see where you've brushed, and she said hers was appearing red. So Eleanor, the reason mine appears dark rather than any other color is I have it set to the exposure default as down 2 stops. So that allows me to visualize where I have painted the brush. So obviously that's way too much, but the placement's about right. So I'm going to double click on the exposure, bring it back up to 0. And I'm going to, probably rather than mess with the exposure, I'm going to bring down the highlights because that'll put minimal impact on the trees, which I don't want to darken too much. But I do want to darken that sky. So I'm going to bring down the highlights. I might bring down the whites. But I think where we're going to see our most dramatic change is in maybe texture. Yeah, it brings in a little detail, kind of overdoes it. I'm not going to mess with texture. But clarity. Clarity is the place when we want to bring in and really enhance that level of contrast. So watch as I scroll this thing up. You can really see those clouds start to come in a much nicer level of detail. I think I probably will bring the exposure down. Maybe a third of a stop, quarter of a stop. Not bad, not bad. I like that, I think. And yeah, I think that looks pretty good. Thanks to William for submitting this. I think we've got a pretty nice comparison of images. So you can see where we started, where we are now. I really like what happened in here. This part of the frame really brought in nice contrast and color, and the sky is much more interesting to look at now. So I saw a couple of chats come up. Let me take a look and see what those questions were, and then we will move on to the next image. Somewhere up here I can do that, I think. There we go. All right, so 2 photos just submitted. I'd like to see work with here. Richard, did you send those to my email address, Richard? If so, I'll try to get to them. We may have to wait till after the main part of the class is over since I've already gotten those done, but I'm happy to work with you at some other point too. How did you straighten the curve? Andrew, I just backed up on the history over here. So on the left side, I just found where I had made the adjustments to the curve and stepped back to the step before that. And that's how I got rid of that. Eleanor, can you get rid of the gray bar that says Talking David over the histogram? That is up to you, Eleanor. You need to drag that piece around. You can close that or drag it and move it around. That is up to how you have your zoom setting done. And there you go. Janice answered that. Okay, thanks. All right, guys, let's go back to our library. Oh, actually, while I'm thinking about it, let's do the one other question that we had, and that is exporting files out of Lightroom. So let's just say, sorry, I'm trying to clear my screen up a little bit. Clean my screen up here a little bit. Let's just say that we wanted to print or export for sharing this image that William created. William's image that I just edited. So what we're going to do is you're going to have that image highlighted, and you're going to go up to File, and you're going to hit Export. And that'll pop up a new window giving you the location you want to put it, whether it's to your hard drive or to directly into an email. I just put it onto my hard drive every time. Then you can choose your location, so you just browse to it. You can create a new subfolder in there if you want to. You can rename your file if you want to. If you're exporting videos, it has video settings for that. But the important parts are down here. This is the file settings, so you can choose, JPEGs, PSDs, TIFFs, PNGs, DNGs, or the original as it was captured. Usually for sharing onto social media or websites, or heck, even publications these days are mostly taking JPEGs. You select JPEG. You can select the color space. So if you're sRGB or Adobe RGB, my default's sRGB. That's kind of the going standard for most use. And honestly, there's not really a heck of a lot of difference in what we can actually see with our eyes between sRGB and Adobe RGB. You can limit the file size and increase or decrease the quality there. Generally around 90% gives you a reasonable size file and still look really good. Anywhere between 75 and 90, 100% will greatly increase the size of your file. And then you can resize your image here. So, but the last export I did was just a small little image from my website to 800 pixels at 72 pixels per inch. You can choose not to enlarge an image. So if you select too much, it won't allow you to there. You can sharpen on output. I do it in Lightroom and I don't sharpen on export. However, if you want to apply some default sharpening, it does give you that option for a couple different things. Make sure I unclick that so next time I don't screw it up. You can include the metadata, so the camera you made it with, your copyright, all that kind of stuff, or not. When I am submitting like to stock agencies or even publications, I don't include the metadata. People are really judgy over what camera you use, especially people who don't know photography. And the fact of the matter is what camera you use should be unimportant to the buyer as long as the image looks good. So I generally just do copyright and usually contact info. That means if somebody else gets the image down the road and they want to know who made it, I have both copyright and they can get a hold of me if they need to. You can apply a watermark if you have a watermark set up in your in Lightroom, and then you can, after export, you can set it up to open in Photoshop or wherever else you want to do. So that's how you export images. It's pretty quick and dirty, pretty self-explanatory if you understand how to do that kind of thing. So we're just going to cancel that. All right, so now we're going to move on to, I believe this was Elaine. Submitted this lovely image of some grizzly bears, and I assume, where is this, Elaine? I would guess this is what, Yellowstone or Tetons?
Tetons. I saw her, several times, but the first time was butt shots.
Yeah, well, you've got a really nice interaction here. The biggest issue, this is Elaine sent me a JPEG here, so it will have a little bit, it won't be quite, our ability to work with it won't be quite as high. But as I zoom in on the important parts at 1:1, and again, you can see how far you've zoomed in by looking up here or adjusting your zoom rate. So at 1:1, which is 1 pixel on my computer screen equals 1 pixel captured on camera, you can see it's pretty sharp considering the distance and considering how far away it is. I know Elaine uses good kit, so I'm sure she was using good lenses here. It does look like she might have missed the focus by just a hair. I think it grabbed this bush rather than the bears. So there is a slight miss there, but it's not so much that I don't think we can deal with it. In terms of what we might want to do, I'd like to see a little bit more detail next to the bears. I think that would help us. And I think we need to increase our concentration. So obviously there is a lot of negative space in this image. I am a fan of showing habitat in wildlife shots. But in this particular instance, the important thing that's happening is this interaction. And having all this negative space, I don't think helps us. If she was selling to a publication or something like that that might be wanting to add text, I think we could do a version of it where we retain some of that negative space while also still having a little bit more emphasis put on what's going on down here. So those are the kind of things that, looking at this, that I know I want to do. She's got some bright highlights here that are a little distracting. I'm not sure, because it's snow, we don't want to make the snow look too gray. So there's probably not too much we can do about that. But we can maybe fit a little bit. But most importantly, I think the thing we can do first is crop it a little bit. And I'm using a freeform crop. So notice I've got this unchecked. The lock over here is unlocked. And I'm just going to sort of experiment a little bit with how I might want to place a crop. So I don't mind the placement in that lower corner. I think that's pretty good, although I might want to experiment a little bit. So I'm bringing in this crop a lot. I don't like to crop a lot, but sometimes it's not a bad idea. And I kind of like that blurry foreground here. That really kind of gives us a chance to push the emphasis of the image northward into the main core of the photo. So that doesn't bother me too much. I think I'd rather have the bears on the left side-ish of the frame. And again, this is very personal choice. So keep in mind that this isn't necessarily the right way to crop an image. It is just a way, and it's the way I'm seeing the photo, not necessarily the right or wrong way. So this is very much a personal decision. I am taking a lot off of this photo. So that's going to make for a much smaller file. If Elaine wants to publish this, I don't like it. I don't like it. Seeing it like this, I don't like it. I think I need more. Yeah, I'm still not completely happy with that crop. I'd probably go back and fiddle with it more as I was processing the photo, and maybe we will do that before we're done. But I think this gives us a starting point. and gets rid of a chunk of unnecessary negative space. If she did want to sell this photo at some point, there's still nice region up here for text, which can be used with later. So we talked about wanting to bring up some of these very dark areas, and overall the exposure I think is quite good. You can see most of her image falls into the bright side of the frame, so she's done very well with her exposure in camera. So I don't want to increase the overall exposure because otherwise I'm going to start blowing out highlights and making the brights look too bright. So I am going to start bringing up the shadows. So look at the image as I do this. You can see where I often don't look, when I'm looking at bringing up a shadow point, I often don't look at where I want the shadows to actually increase. I know that this is dark, and so that's going to brighten up. What I'm afraid of is losing shadows and making other areas of the frame look too foggy. So when I am bringing up something like shadows, I am often looking up here somewhere or down here. That's where I'm looking to decide when I've gone too far and what I can deal with and what we might be able to have to do later using brush and selective adjustments. So you can see it right about this point. You start to lose some of those nice contrasty areas we've got in that sagebrush prairie in the background there. So I think that's about as far as I'd want to go with the shadows slider. With the whites, I think we'll bring the whites down a little bit because that those highlights in that snow are a little bit too hot and are a little distracting. So I think I'll bring the whites down a little bit. And the last one, the blackest part of our frame is here in this bear's chest. And so I am going to bring that up just a little bit. And that's probably our only place that's really, truly dark. And you can see a little bit start to come back up. So as we zoom in there, we can see that there's a bit of hair starting to appear on the chest, which we did not have before. I'm going to step back here so you can see how much darker that is, a couple of steps back. And there we have much more detail. She's actually, bear highlights in their eyes are bears have really small eyes. And so they're often very hard to catch highlights in the eyes, but she did. So this one, you don't need to do a lot of eye brightening here because the eyes already look pretty good. So I think we're in a pretty good place there, at least. So texture, this can add a little bit of sharpness apparent, but it'll be across the image, but that's okay. Maybe I probably don't want to do too much clarity because I think see how it changes that background so much. So I don't think I'm going to mess with that too much. Dehaze, I'm not even going to touch because I know exactly what that's going to do. And well, I'll show you. It's going to make it look weird very quickly. So I'm not even going to dehaze at all. And a little bit of vibrance. There's a little bit of color in this image. So, having a little vibrance doesn't hurt. Brings out the red tones in the bear's coat as well as in the vegetation. And maybe a little bit of saturation, but nothing major. So there's our starting point. And we're going to come down later. So we talked about sharpness being an issue in the bear's face and this area. So rather than do a sharpness in the detail section, which will change the sharpness across the image, I am going to do that just locally using the brush. So I'm going to select a brush with a fairly large feather. I'm up to a 91 feather. I have auto mask turned on. I don't want that. I'm going to turn that off because if I have auto mask on, it's the edge between the bear's coat and the background is not likely to be distinct enough for Lightroom to pick up. And so I am just going to go in here. And again, I have my exposure default set to 2 stops below, so I can easily see where I'm painting. And that's the main area I'm worried about being sharp, is right there. So we're going to reset that exposure back up to 0. This is a good place if you want to bring up even a little bit more detail. You can bring up the shadows even a little bit more. Maybe even the blacks down the chest. We are starting to introduce some noise. There's a little bit of pixelation starting to come in down here as Lightroom is starting to have to make compromises. But we've got a nice bright face now. And here, a little bit of localized texture. Boom, see, looks much sharper all of a sudden. There is a sharpness slider here. We can increase sharpness itself. And because we introduced a little bit of noise, I'm going to do a little localized noise reduction right there as well. Wait, hang on. This is backwards from what it is in the main slider. There goes the noise. So, you know, that helped us quite a bit, I think. Let's just take a step back here and you can see what we had before we started. So you can see it really, actually, let's go all the way back here. Oh, wrong one. So let's go here. Oops. Come on. There we go. So there's where we started in terms of sharpness in the bear's face, and there's where we ended up. So that really, because it was not very much out of sharp, we were able to bring back just about all the sharpness that we needed in that photo. So a little bit of detail work there, really brought out some details here. The crop, I think, is pretty good, although Elaine, you could certainly adjust that however you felt for whatever purpose you were going to put this image to. And then, as always, I love a little vignette. I think it really helped bring our attention. This one could probably get away with a pretty strong vignette. You know, and the one filter we didn't talk about at all is this one. So this is the Radial Filter. And you can do the same thing. If you want to have a pretty localized vignette, like if you just want a small off-center part of your frame to be vignetted, you can apply that using this tool. So that's the area that we want to have. Everything else in the image gets darkened. Obviously, we're not going to do it that much. But something like, so there's, there it is. There's 0. That's how the image looked before we started this process. And then you can bring that down. You can see it still looks pretty good, but all of our attention now is starting to fall on where those bears are rather than on the background. And we can still add and actually, here, let's do this too. So go back, I'm going to grab that filter again, selecting that filter. And the other thing we can do is reduce the texture in the rest of the image. So I'm going to kind of overdo it here so you can see what I'm saying. So you can see the only part that's remaining sharp is the area around the bears. But, you know, but a slight reduction in the sharpness across the rest of the image. And I don't want to lose all the sharpness. I'm going to pull that out this way. Changes a lot about how our image is looking. You can still add a vignette without hurting things too much. Good, right? Not bad. So let's look at our comparison again. In the wrong section here. There we go. Actually, it was easier to see on the top bottom. So top is where we started, bottom is where we ended. As I look at that, seeing that comparison, I might have overdone it a little bit. But I think that gives you guys the tools to see. I think I overdid the reduction of the sharpness in the background. I think that looks a little bit processed. But it does give you, show you kind of the tools that we can apply to the situation. And that's the thing about anything with photography in general, but post-production in particular, is making sure that you're being honest with yourself. Have I overdone it? Because we do have a tendency to creep. Oh, a little more saturation. Oh, a little more sharpness. Oh, a little more, you know, blur in the background. All those things tend to build up cumulative effects on an image. And I do think I probably went a little too far with the background there. So we could fix that, but I think instead we will move on to the next photograph. Nice photo. Thank you for sharing that, Elaine. I hope that was useful. Let me go back all the way to the beginning before we even cropped it, and you can see where we started and where we ended up. Here it is without the radial filter applying the texture adjustment. So that's what it looked like before the texture adjustment. That's where it looked like after the texture adjustment. And you can see it, you know, kind of make your own decision on whether or not that was too much or not. I think it was a little too much. So, oops. All right, I saw a couple of chats come in. Let me check, see what questions we have. Okay, Kelly, so how do you make all of your brushes filters have a -2 exposure by default? Good question. So when you open up a new brush, if you set anything you change before you actually apply a brush anywhere, will become the default for the next brush. So I'll just quickly sample you. So if I wanted to overexpose my brush and paint in a section right there, and then put in a new brush, the new default is plus 2.72. So that's how anything you would change before you apply a feature will be the base setting for the next time you apply a brush. Got it? So I just have mine, that's just where I kind of have mine set. So I've got it set to -2. I applied a little bit of a brush there. And now the next time I apply a brush, clicking on new brush, oops, new brush, it's already, you can see, set to -2.16. So no special trick there. That's just, it just remembers what you used the last time. Okay, what was the other question? I saw Janice had a question there too. Good. And when you use the radial filter and then change the sharpness, does it automatically make the sharpness change in the part not in the radial filter? Good question. I forgot to mention that. So going back to our radial filter here, I'm going to highlight that filter. And you can see that there is a little tick box down here called invert. So if you have it inverted, it affects the area inside the filter circle. If you have it unchecked, it's the area outside the filter circle. So if I invert that, all the changes we applied to the outside, the reduction in exposure, the reduction in texture, all become applied to the inside of the image. And if we uncheck it, then it all is applied to the outside. So that's how you switch it, where it's applied and where it isn't. All right, any other questions? Nope. All right, then we will move on. Okay, now this gorgeous image was sent in by Stu. Thanks, Stu. This is a beauty. I am guessing this is maybe from your house in Fairbanks, looking south towards Deborah and Hess. Beautiful shot. I look at this. Obviously, there are a couple of. I'm going to make this a little bigger to see. There we go. This is just a really gorgeous image. You've got a lot going on, some things that need to be rectified, but mostly it's good. So, okay, obviously looking at this streak of orange where the mountains are falling is definitely pretty important. That is where our key. But as I look more at this image, I'm also seeing, of course, the detail in the Alaska Range foothills here, and then this sort of streak of almost light sunlit haze that's right here along the bottom of the image. And I think that looks really nice. Things that aren't so nice, there might be a little bit too much dark cloud here, although I'm not sure. I'd kind of want to see it as we process this a little further to find out whether I think this is all necessary. The tangle of trees here at the bottom, that needs to go, as does this here on the right side. I think we will crop a little off the bottom to get rid of the bulk of that. And we'll crop a little bit off the right to bring these mountains a little bit more into center, as well as to get rid of some of this messiness here on the side of the image. So we'll crop first. First thing I'm going to do, bring in that right side. We'll get rid of most of those annoying branches that way. And then we're going to bring up the bottom by some amount. Because I brought up the bottom, that made the comment I made about the upper part of the frame even more so, that I think there's just too much darkness happening up here, and I don't really see it as playing an important role. There is a couple things you might be able to do to change that, but I think for the time being, I'm going to go with a crop that's a slight panoramic. Not a huge panorama, but a slightly, long, wide rectangle. And we'll use that as a starting point. And then the next thing I want to do, rather than start diving into here, is this is going to take a little bit of cloning. Fortunately, we've got good places to draw our clone from. So in order to get rid of these, I am making my brush. You can see how large I'm making my brush there compared to the things we want to do. Most of these I can probably get away with getting rid of in one clean stamp. I have found, okay, so remember there's two options when we're using the clone. There's heal and there's clone. Because our branches are pretty dark and the clone source is pretty dark, heal is probably going to get us a better result. If you are cloning away a fairly large area of dark off of a pale background, you're going to need to use full clone, because the heel brush is going to take a compromise brightness from what you're getting rid of and what you're trying to replace it with, and that kind of messes things up. I don't know why Lightroom's not very good at choosing its sources. So when I know what we're getting rid of, that's easy. When Lightroom defaulted, it chose a spot up here. I don't really know why it picked that rather than, you know, right next door. So very often Lightroom gets it wrong in terms of choosing where to grab. So make sure you feel free to not take the defaults and just move the source, move your source pixels away from whatever Lightroom picked. This one is a little more oblong. You can see it's from top to bottom. So I'm going to do a strip like that. You can see Lightroom, again, it moved the pixels upwards, which means it kind of created this screwy little section in that nice haze line that was there. So I'm going to go over here, make sure that my little horizon line there is lined up with both source and destination pixels. Better. Do have a little bit of tangle here still at the bottom. Because it's so obscure, that doesn't bother me. And then I'm going to grab that. And again, Lightroom chose a spot that is just too high up. Trying to choose some source pixels that don't include any branches. And that's pretty good. These are going to be a little trickier. They're going to require a little bit more. I'm going to do a pretty quick and dirty job here. For really advanced cloning, I almost always use Photoshop rather than Lightroom. Photoshop, for some reason, is just better at it. But that works. Get rid of that. Lightroom did okay picking that one. And this one's pretty small and almost, but not quite, breaks that horizon line. So I'm going to go right to the base of that horizon. And you can see how it, because we're using heel, it grabbed a little bit of this sort of feathered area up here and made that pale. If we went to a full clone, that goes away. All right. Not bad, right? Looks pretty good. We got rid of most of those branches. We could probably do a little bit more detail work. I think I missed. Yeah, you can see there's a little, actually, I'm not sure, that might be in the background. Yeah, anyway, we did a pretty good job. There's a little bit more up there we could get rid of with a little more touch up, but we'll move on. Okay, so now we've got the base image well set up for what we're going to do. And there's a few things. So we really want to make the most of what we've got going on in this center area. I really look, God, these mountains are so beautiful. In this Alaska, I want to go home. This area is beautiful. These clouds are just outstanding. And so I think what's really going to help us bring out that cloud line is probably a little bit of texture and a little bit of clarity. And so before well, that's out of order, so I'm not going to. I'm going to do a quick pass with these highlights. You know, I'm probably not going to adjust very much because I like how this looks. No, I don't really like that either. You know, whites are burning out the highlights there. Yeah, that just makes it look hazy. So, you know, this is a rare photo where I don't think you can improve too much in terms of localized contrast and localized adjustments in the highlights, shadows, whites, and blacks as what Stu managed to grab out of camera. This is a raw image out of camera. So beautiful. Texture. So this will help us bring in a little bit of sharpness because of the distance. I suspect this was taken with a fairly large telephoto, certainly from the Fairbanks area looking south to the mountains of the Alaska range. And because it's so far, there's just a little bit of inherent loss of sharpness to those mountains. Our texture is going to help bring that back. But where I want you to look in particular is this area. So where you have these clouds coming down that are lit up by the sunlight, that beautiful interaction there. As I bring the texture up, that should really come in. And we'll probably localize some adjustments there to make that even more so. A little bit of clarity will probably help us. It is starting to make the image look a touch noisy. No, not too bad. A little bit. Yeah, there's a little bit of noise here and there. You can see when I've zoomed into 1:1, that distance, there's just haze. And not just haze, but there's also shimmer. you know, heat shimmer, distance shimmer, all along the edges. And there's nothing you can do about that. In fact, it's not even necessarily a bad thing in an image like this because it is a distant shot. It doesn't bother me. It might bother some of you, doesn't bother me. All right, so a little bit of clarity. I don't think I'm gonna apply dehaze, but let's see what it looks like. Yeah, it really darkens everything. Yeah, I don't see that it does much good for us either. We might use dehaze and some localized adjustments. Probably doesn't need a lot of vibrance or saturation either because it's already, those colors are quite saturated. I believe this was shot with a Nikon, and Nikons do a very nice job with color saturation. They use Sony sensors in modern Nikons, and they are very good with making sure your colors are well saturated, a little oversaturated in some people's mind. Okay, so here we go. You know, you can see I haven't really changed very much. It looks really good. But there's some localized adjustments I think we can do. And one of those, as I really want to bring in some, if I can, I'd like to provide a little bit of emphasis into this very cool streak of haze that falls right along the mountain line there. So using my adjustment brush, and a smaller brush than that, probably something about like this. You know, I want to grab much of that area. I have my exposure set to 2 stops down so I can see where I'm painting. And I'm just going to take a streak across the horizon. Okay, so I have painted in that line. Obviously, we're not going to leave it like that. So I'm bringing that exposure back up to 0. And I'm going to take the highlights from that, because the highlights, when I adjust the highlights there, it's just the brightest part of what I painted in, not the whole image. And so watch as I slide this highlight slider up. You can see that the brighter parts of that little hazy line start to come in. I can reduce the shadows, probably not too much. I don't know if that's working quite as I envisioned it. Let's try a little contrast. No, that's not doing it either. A little bit of fiddling always in order. A little bit of exposure, a little bit of highlights, shadows down a touch. Now maybe we're getting there. A little bit of clarity maybe. That's kind of getting there a little bit more. And then one other adjustment I'm going to do is I'm going to warm that area and see if we can't make that haze, not that much, but a little bit warmer. That's not bad. It's not bad at all. Maybe a little saturation might even make that come in a little more. Probably, I don't know, that's pretty close. Maybe not quite that much. For demonstration purposes, I think that works. I'd probably fine tune that a little bit. And then we're going to take another brush and we're going to run it through the mountains. Oops. My bad. I forgot to click a new brush. So I don't want to add a brush stroke. Otherwise, it applied to it applied the changes we did to the horizon to that up there. So if you want to add a new brush, gotta click new. Sorry about that. Now let's do that again. Big brush, big feather, 2 brush strokes. Grab all of that area. All right. Now we'll bring it back up how it was and do a little fine tuning. So let's just do a little a little localized changes here. I don't really know what I'm kind of going for here, so I'm just going to experiment. But let's do a little texture increase because I really do like this area. I like what we've got going on there. A little clarity. Too much. Maybe a little exposure down. Not that much. Yeah, a little exposure reduction, I think helped. I think I'm liking where I'm going with this. You know, especially when it's not an image of mine that I didn't have a vision for as I made it. I find the process of editing is much more experimental. And let's see what dehaze does a little bit in this area. Not too bad. Brought in some detail into this part of the clouds, which I like. So yeah, not too bad. What do you think, Stu? You liking where I've taken that, or did you have a different view for how you might want to take that?
Oh, Dave, thanks. Yeah, you really worked the magic well. From what, yeah, that was a rare morning on the Alaska Range from the deck, you know, this midwinter, and so yeah, it was pretty outstanding. But I know when I tried shooting a bunch of different, I had you know, exposed for the back mostly for the highlights, and so everything was underexposed. But I like the way you brought that haze up, or that line in the bottom, because I remember it was over the flats there, and that was really strong. And so you brought that out, and great job.
Good. Yeah. Well, you know, like I said, these are all just, think of them as my take on an image rather than on something specific that it needs to be done. So, but yeah, this is a beautiful photo. The last thing I would do here is, because we've done a bit of, well, and there's just a little bit of noise. I suspect it was probably fairly high ISO. There is a little bit of noise up here. I think we can do some noise reduction, probably a fair amount, because it's not super sharp because of the distance. You can do a lot of noise reduction and really smooth this out. Because this is an image that I could really see printed, you can see it's gone. We just, by bringing it up to 39, we basically got rid of all the noise in the image. And a little bit of, you know, tiny pixelation down here, but nothing should be any concern. And, you know, probably just because it looks good on 90% of images, a little bit of vignetting will probably really help us bring that in. And come on. There's where we started, and there's where we ended. I think it's better, minus the crop, of course, because it doesn't show the crop. So yeah, beautiful image, Stu. Thank you so much for sharing that. I appreciate your contribution. And yeah, all right. Let's go back. We are at 3 o'clock, so let me take a minute to answer questions. And then there was one other kind of quick covers of a complicated image that that Janice sent in. And so I think we will, yeah, let's answer questions, and then if people want to stick around for a rather more complicated, quick processing that there's a much easier way to do, but I did find a way to do it here. We can do that. Let me stop the screen share. And all right. So questions. Let me see if there's anything in our missed those views from the deck, Lisa. Oh yeah, I know, me too. God, I'm ready to go home, guys. I hope all of you are someplace you're enjoying. Although I'm not suffering here in Colorado, I am ready to head home. Okay, so questions. Anybody got anything for me? Anybody? All right, well, seeing no questions, I will say goodbye to those of you who need to take off. If you want to stick around for 1 or 2 more minutes, Janice, I'm going to run through your images that you sent. They were a bit more complex, and there was a much easier way to do it than I found to do it through Lightroom, but I did find a way to make what you wanted to happen. So if people want to stick around for that, great. Oh, I did want to add one thing. Actually, I'll just send it around over email afterwards, so no rush. All right, so.
Thanks, Dave. Catch up with you
no
later.
problem at all. Thanks, guys. I'm glad you enjoyed it. We're going to dive back into this last image, but feel free to take off if you got other places to be.
Thank you.
Yep. Take care, Heather. Thanks for coming. All right. So Janice sent in these 2 images. This guy of elk backwards, and this one of the same elk, but she missed the mountains in the above the top of the frame, and she was wondering if in Lightroom there was a way, to take this part of the image and apply it to that photograph, which looks a lot prettier. The short answer is no. It is a very difficult thing to do in Lightroom. When I was experimenting with this, I'll just show you. So I was like, okay, well, maybe we can just do a panorama. And that will, a vertical panorama will join those 2 images. We'll apply that, extend the sky, and hey, bingo, we're in business. But what it does is give us a 2-headed elk. So not exactly what we were going for. So a straight up panorama will not work unless you want to create a mutant elk. So we're not going to do that. So what I did next was I took this photograph and I cropped just the sky. And then I exported that. So I did the crop, and then I exported this file as a JPEG and brought it back in. Right, it's right here. This is the one. And then I created a panoramic using that thing, and I'll show you what happened when I did that. So we'll grab these two. Oops, not that one. Oops, hang on. That and that. And now we're gonna do, oops, dang it. Now we're gonna photo merge again. And what happened is that because your images were slightly off from one another, it doesn't quite match up. So we get it, it's all there, and you can boundary warp it, make Lightroom, but then your elk starts to look like a really long-faced horse, and everything starts to look a little off. You lose some of the sky anyway, so that didn't really do it. So the only way I found that I could do it was to boundary warp to a certain degree, getting rid of a good portion of that without making our elk look a little too weird. Also changing the projection, whether it's spherical, cylindrical, perspective, all of those do seem to play a little bit of a role. Perspective probably looks the best. I don't know how that'll look when we boundary warp it. Not too bad, actually. So perspective probably works best, but you still end up with these white hashes. So in Photoshop, those white sections are no big deal. But in Lightroom, for whatever reason, so here's where we have it. So this is what I kind of ended up with when I was playing with it. And in Lightroom, it views these white areas as having no pixels whatsoever. Not white pixels, but no pixels, which means it won't allow you to clone things in. And so I took the file that was made, I exported it as a TIFF, and then I imported it, and then I went through the process of cloning these spots out. You can see I was, as I went through the process here on the left. I'm not going to do it for you because it's a little too time consuming to cover in a couple of minutes. But I was able to clone out most of that area and ended up with an image, that shows the mountain and shows your elk, and it doesn't look too funny. And we could do a quick post process using the standard tools over here. Bring up the shadows, maybe a little exposure, bring the whites down, blacks up, a little texture, a little clarity. Obviously I'm doing this super fast. And we can see we ended up with a pretty nice little microscopic touch up on the eye. And we've got an elk in a meadow with a mountain in the background. That took a lot of work to get to that point. So, looking at these images, where we started and where we ended up, wasn't worth the effort to do it in Lightroom. Photoshop would have been much quicker. You can do the same photo merge panorama in Photoshop, and it will create a file that can easily be have those sections cloned out. I probably could have done it in half the time. So it's possible to do it in Lightroom, but it is very time consuming, and Photoshop is much better at it. So that was the long and short of that particular answer. All right, here was another image. Who sent this one? Oh, Anne sent this one. I apologize, Anne, for not getting to this photo. This is a good one. Feel free to leave, but I'll do a quick process here of Anne's image. This is a beautiful shot. Rocky Mountains and Compagre area, I'm guessing. Anne, are you still on? Not sure, she may have taken off. But let's see if she's still here.
I'm still here.
Oh, you're still there, Ann. Yep. So yeah, is this? I assume this is Uncompahgre area near your place in Creed.
Yes.
Yeah.
This is up
Yes.
near the headwaters.
Okay. So yeah, beautiful shot. Things that really feature well here. You've got nice fall colors starting to come in, sort of early fall. Great patterns in the clouds, minus of course the contrail lines, but there's not much we can do about that without some advanced cloning. I don't particularly like this dead tree here on the left. I think that's that we don't need that. And then you've got this stick sticking up here out of the bottom part of the frame, which certainly doesn't play anything important in the image. But you've got a lot of good stuff going on. But let's start off with our crop. Bring it that way. Don't need quite so much sky. I think that will do us. Probably not quite. I don't know. I kind of like that left side, that right side of the frame. A little more sky than that. Yeah, so quick crop. I would get rid of this guy with our clone tool. Gone. And now we've got a nice base image to work from. Looking at this, I think we need more details in the shadows. You've lost a little bit in the pure black range. So you can see when I hover over that on the pink triangle, you can look back into the aspens and you can see that blue come in. So that's where we've lost detail. I don't think that's going to affect us too much. It's not enough of the image to really cause us problems. So let's do some quick adjustments here. Because there's nothing really complicated that needs to happen here, I think we can do most of our adjustments quite quickly. A little increase in the shadows is bringing in some detail back here. Whites, whites, especially when you have a little bit of cloud pop or a little bit of, highlights that you want to retain, increasing your whites can be nice. Blacks. Yeah, I'm not going to do much with the blacks. I can bring them up a little bit. A little texture, you can see you add too much texture and it starts to, I'm pointing at the screen, that's really helpful. You can see what I'm pointing at. But down here, if you look, you can see that if you bring the texture up all the way up, it tends to create these highlight spots where there was probably a reflection off leaves or something like that, but it starts to look a little false. But you can bring that up a touch without hurting anything for sure. Don't understand why I just got a blue spot here on my frame. I suspect that's just a remnant of something else. We talked about whites already. Texture, clarity. Probably don't need very much clarity. You've already got a nice crisp image. It was obviously a bright day, so we don't need to worry about that too much. A little bit of vibrance, particularly to increase those greens and golds coming into the aspens and bring out a little bit of the blue. Something's funny going on back here. I think I might have overdone the texture. That looks a little weird back there. Maybe the shadows are up too high. I don't know why I'm getting a blue spot here, but I suspect my computer, I'm just asking my computer to do too many things right now. I have changed my mind on the crop. I think we do need to reduce that amount of sky. Maybe bring this in just a hint. Okay, better. And a slight color adjustment here. I'm going to use our little eyedropper tool because I really want to this area. So I'm using the saturation right now. I'm going to bring in the saturation of those oranges and those reds. I think that's mostly red there. I think there's not too much red. It's mostly orange and yellow. So see how that made that pop a bit? And then I'm also going to increase that luminance in those same areas. And that should make those areas of the frame brighter and draw our attention to them, hopefully, and allow us to see that. So,
Okay.
yeah. So luminance, saturation, localized adjustments just to the oranges and reds, I think has helped that part of the frame. The sky looks pretty good, but I am going to grab our brush tool. Because we have a pretty good differential between our sky and our foreground in the mountains, rather, I'm going to turn on the auto mask. I'm going to use a fairly large brush, and I am going to paint in the sky. My poor computer is having a very hard time keeping up with what I'm asking it to do right now. And you can see it's actually selecting just the clouds. So you'll have to repeat over some areas a couple of times in order to make sure it's grabbing everything that you want it to grab when you're using the auto mask tool.
Okay.
And a little bit smaller brush here as I go on that horizon line. All right, a little bit rough, but I think it did it. Okay, now we're gonna bring that exposure back up. We probably will bring it down a little bit. It's the brightest part of our frame right now. I think we can reduce that exposure in the sky a little bit. But mostly what I want to do is bring up the clarity, which should also provide a little bit of darkening. Not that much. And a little bit of texture. And the last thing, well, not the last if we were really doing a full process, but a last rough cut, a little bit of vignette. Where we started, where we ended up. Pretty big difference in a very short little period of time. I think I really like what we did here, this section.
Right. Right.
The section where you got got the nice color that brought in some nice highlights. Yeah, it created a little bit of, see, it created a little bit of a halo around the edge of the mountain there. It does look a little bit fakey there. Probably need to back up a little bit on the sky adjustments to make sure that doesn't look too weird, particularly if you were going to print it or show it big or anything like that. Going back to that sky brush, we can even adjust warm the tones of that sky a little bit, a little less kind of deep. Well, we could go kind of a deep mountain blue, not that deep. But you could play a little bit with where you wanted the tones to be in the sky, whether you want them warm or cool. But that's one thing you could adjust as well.
Okay.
So, yeah, I think that's not a bad first pass. You know, we might consider doing maybe darkening a little bit of the foreground here. Ansel Adams was I don't know if notorious is the right word, but he very much liked darkening just certain parts of an image. When he was playing with photos, he would very often in the dark room take a corner where he thought there wasn't much going on and but he needed the rest of the bottom of the frame so it couldn't be cropped out. And he'd just darken it just a little bit. And by darkening a section of the frame, it just, you know, it draws our attention is naturally drawn to bright areas. And so though it was very subtle, just a third of a stop, 0.29,
Okay.
minus 0.29, we were able to darken up this section of the foreground just a little bit, you know. I'll turn off the filter and then I'll step back.
Okay. I like that.
And
I like that a
yeah,
lot.
so, you know, you can, if you step back, you can see that foreground become a little brighter and a little darker. And that's a, you know, a very subtle change, but maybe something that can play a little bit of a role in the image.
Okay.
So there we go. Let me end the screen share here. Oops, not in the screen share, stop share. There we go. All right, so yeah, thanks guys for sticking around a little bit longer. Anybody have any questions now? I saw another one pop up. For print purposes, how would you export this image for long edges? So if you were printing, Eleanor, you generally want to export it at least 300 pixels per inch or DPI, dots per inch. Pixels per inch is a screen related number. Dots per inch is a printing related number, but they are, you know, they correspond to one another. So I would probably export this at the native resolution. So whatever the biggest natural file size is, in that particular case, I'm not sharing the screen, but I'm going back to check how big it is. So it's a big file. The cropped version of that image of Anne's we just did was 6,979 by 4,428. So that's a big file. She could print that large if she wanted to. And I would export that at that same resolution. I wouldn't change that, and at 300 DPI. And then, you know, kind of the size, the aspect ratio you choose would depend on how you want it printed. So I'm sure you could find an aspect ratio for that, probably 16 by 9 or something like that. That would be more or less accurate to what the crop we applied was, or you'd adjust the crop slightly to fit whatever you decided was your print size. So I recently printed an image quite large. It ended up being a 20 by 30 for a client. And that photo, you know, I spent a little bit of while trying to talk to them with the space they were trying to apply it to. So they had a kind of a square space. They didn't want to put a big rectangle into a square section of wall. And so we printed it as just a slightly off from square at, you know, at a 20 by 30. So actually it's a 20, no, I lied, it's a 24 by 30. So it's not quite a square. All right. So Andrew, are you able to do the same tutorials in Photoshop? You know, Andrew, I am just not as good in Photoshop as I am in Lightroom. I feel like I am pretty much a novice in Photoshop. So I can refer you to some people who are really good at it, and you'd probably be better off learning from them than you would for me. I can do what I need to do in Photoshop, but I tend to fuss around, and I wouldn't be a very good teacher of that. However, if you have specific questions, you know, feel free to call me, or, you know, we can talk and we can try to figure it out.
You'd be excellent at anything, David.
Professional cycling. I'm afraid not. Yeah, I appreciate that, Andrew, but there are some things I'm better at than others. So nice. All right. Any other questions? Anything else anybody wanted to talk about? Anything I didn't cover over these 4 classes? I think this may be our last Lightroom class. I think we've covered about everything. I did want to mention that I think I sent it out in an email, but I have put up, if you know, don't feel at all obligated, but I have set up that donation page. If anybody wants to contribute some to me for putting these on, you are welcome to do so. Please don't feel obligated. Some of you have already done so. I thank you very much for that. But I'm just happy to have you guys as part of my photographic community. I learn a lot putting these on, and so don't feel obligated. But if you would like, that last email I sent out has a link. Anything else that I was going to mention? I am hoping to start heading back to Alaska in the next week or 2, so I'm not sure I'm going to be around to do another one of these classes in the next couple of weeks. However, I may have time as we get into June. So if there are particular things that you guys would like to learn about, we could talk about composition. We can talk, you know, we could do a little bit more post-processing stuff if there's specific things we want to talk about. But I definitely think we can talk a bit about composition, photo strategy, settings, all of those other kind of aspects of photography that are maybe a little more esoteric than just post-processing, but play a really important role in what we do. So anything else that people have got?
Well, David, thank you for doing the bears. That was a wonderful experience for me. And I have been using the Radial Filter around the bears and was not happy. And I like you using the brush on that. Mm-hmm. I think that helped.
Good. The Radial Filter is a tool I really don't use very often, but I hadn't showed it, so I thought it was a good place to show how it works. I actually used it on an image. If you guys are on my Facebook page, that flower I shared yesterday, I actually used the Radial for without, and because sometimes it's appropriate, sometimes it's really effective, sometimes it's not.
Well, I feel so much better about going back to it and seeing what I can come up with.
Well, it's a lovely little moment that you got there, so I hope you managed to get something you like out of it.
Right. She was on a carcass. Mama was on a carcass, and the cubs were playing. Nice. And I had the park biologist beside me. And
oh, fun.
He didn't tell me to leave.
Well, as long as you were there and you weren't getting yourself into trouble like so many tourists do, I suspect that's that they'll allow you to get away with a lot when you're following the rules. So, all right.
Thanks,
well,
David.
Yeah,
Appreciate
you're welcome,
it.
guys.
Talk to you later.
Yeah, as always, feel free to email me with questions. And yeah, and if anybody wants to do a one-on-one session, I do offer that as well. So, although you have to pay for that. So, all right, take care, guys.
Bye-bye.
All right, take care, everyone. Have a safe next week. Yep.
See you later, David. Thank you.
Yep.
Thanks, Dave.
Yeah, take care, all.